I did not notice the moment it began, because nothing actually happened. There was no argument, no rejection, no visible shift in behavior. People did not turn away from me or act hostile. They simply failed to respond, as if my presence had not reached whatever part of them registered other people as real. The first time I became aware of it was in a grocery store. I stood in line with a basket in my hands, close enough to feel the warmth of the person in front of me. When the line moved, I moved with it. When it stopped, I stopped. Everything worked the way it was supposed to. Except when I reached the register, the cashier looked past me and addressed the man behind me. Not rudely, not aggressively, just naturally, as if I were an empty space that required no acknowledgement. I stepped aside, assuming I had misunderstood the flow of the line. The man paid. Another customer stepped forward. I tried to speak, but my voice landed nowhere. The cashier continued scanning items that were not mine. I left without protest, mildly embarrassed by something I could not explain. I told myself it was nothing. Fatigue, distraction, a social misalignment that happens more often than people admit. I walked home and tried to forget it. Over the next few days, similar moments accumulated. Doors did not hold open when I approached. People stepped into my path without adjusting their movement. Conversations did not pause when I entered a room. I was not being avoided. Avoidance requires recognition. This felt different. I was being bypassed. At work, meetings continued as if I were not seated at the table. Slides advanced without reference to the notes I had prepared. When I sent emails, they were not returned, but they were not marked unread either. It was as if the messages passed through the system without attaching to a recipient. When I spoke during a discussion, no one interrupted me. No one reacted. The conversation simply continued, on the assumption that no sound had been made. I began monitoring my own behavior carefully. I watched how close I stood to others. I checked my volume. I tested eye contact. Nothing produced a response. My reflection remained intact. Mirrors confirmed that I occupied space. Windows reflected my movement accurately. I cast shadows. Automatic doors sometimes opened for me, but not consistently, as if the sensors could detect mass, but hesitated to assign intent. What unsettled me most was the absence of resistance. People did not recoil when I brushed past them. They did not apologize when collisions occurred. Their bodies adjusted without registering conflict, the way one adjusts to air or furniture that has always been there. I had become part of the environment. I tried to provoke acknowledgement. I dropped objects in crowded spaces. I stood directly in front of someone reading a sign. I waved my hands in front of faces. Reactions were delayed, indirect, misattributed. Someone would glance around, frown slightly, then return to what they were doing, as if sensing an anomaly without locating its source. I called a friend. The phone rang. It was answered. I heard breathing. I said my name. There was a pause, then a polite question, asking who was calling. I repeated myself. The line went quiet. Not disconnected, just suspended. When I spoke again, the call ended. I began to understand that this was not about invisibility. I was not hidden. I was unregistered. Whatever mechanism people used to confirm that another person existed was failing to activate in my presence. I occupied space without being counted. That realization changed how I moved through the city. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. I crossed streets without hesitation. I entered buildings without slowing. I could stand anywhere without consequence because nothing reacted to my claim of space. It was not freedom. It was a lack of friction. And friction, I realized, is how reality confirms you. The most disturbing moment came late one evening when I returned to my apartment building. I unlocked my door. It opened. Inside, the lights were on. Someone was sitting at my table, using my laptop. They did not look up when I entered. They did not freeze or act surprised. They simply continued typing. I stood there for a long time, waiting for recognition that never came. I checked the screen. The document open was familiar. It was my work. Not copied, not stolen, continued. The writing style was mine. The cursor moved with confidence, as if whoever was using it knew exactly what came next. I backed away slowly and left the apartment. In the hallway mirror, I still existed. But something else had begun to occupy the places where my existence used to matter. That night, lying on a bench outside, I tried to recall the last time someone had clearly responded to me. Not politely, not out of habit, truly responded. I could not place the moment. The timeline blurred quickly, as if memory itself was having trouble confirming that interaction had ever occurred. What frightened me was not the isolation. It was the efficiency. The world did not struggle to accommodate my absence. It adjusted smoothly. Processes continued. People flowed around the gap I should have occupied without slowing down. And for the first time, I considered a possibility that felt colder than fear. Maybe I was not disappearing. Maybe the world was simply learning that it did not need to notice me at all. I began the second day with an experiment. If people no longer confirmed my presence, I wanted to know whether systems still would. Machines, unlike humans, rely on thresholds and triggers. They do not decide whether something matters. They detect whether it exists. I went to a subway station during the morning rush. The crowd moved densely, predictably. I stepped toward the turnstiles without slowing. The gate did not close on me, but it did not open either. I passed through as the person ahead of me exited, the barrier reacting late, as if uncertain whether another body had followed. No alarm sounded. No indicator flashed. The system accepted the movement without assigning it ownership. On the platform, cameras were visible from every angle. I stood beneath one and waved. I stepped back and forth across its field of view. I jumped. I stood still. Nothing happened. Security screens in a nearby booth displayed the platform clearly. People moved through the frame. Trains arrived and departed. In the exact space where I stood, there was a slight distortion, like heat shimmer, but no figure. I recorded myself on my phone. The preview showed me holding the device, my hand wrapped around it. When I stopped recording and played the video back, the frame showed an empty platform and a phone floating briefly before dropping out of view, as if the camera had corrected an error. I deleted the file and tried again. The same result. Live view acknowledged me. Stored data did not. I returned to my apartment cautiously. The door unlocked. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed, yet the sense of occupation remained. My chair was slightly misaligned. A glass in the sink contained condensation that had not fully evaporated. My laptop was closed, warm. I opened it. The document from the night before had advanced several paragraphs. The writing matched my tone, my pacing, my hesitation patterns, but it addressed situations I had not yet encountered, references to places I had not visited, observations I had not made. It felt less like someone imitating me and more like a continuation that no longer required my input. I checked my account activity. Login records showed no unauthorized access. All timestamps aligned with my usual working hours. The system registered productivity, not presence. I decided to visit my workplace in person. If nothing else, the security desk would require acknowledgement. I walked past the receptionist. She did not look up. The access gate remained open after the previous employee entered. I followed without resistance. At my desk, my nameplate was gone. The desk itself remained. Someone else was using it. They were efficient, focused. They had my posture, my mannerisms. When they reached for a mug, they picked up the one I used to use. I stood close enough to see the steam rise. I checked the office directory. My name was still listed. My photo had been replaced by a generic placeholder image, the kind used when data fails to load. My role description remained intact. I tried to speak to my manager. I stood in his doorway and said his name. He looked up, puzzled, and glanced past me. His eyes moved as if tracking a sound that had no source. He asked if someone was there. No one answered. I noticed something then that I had missed before. When people almost reacted to me, they did not react emotionally. There was no fear, irritation, or confusion. Only mild procedural uncertainty, like a form missing a field. I tested a different approach. I interacted with the environment more forcefully. I knocked a stack of papers off a table. Someone bent down and gathered them, frowning slightly, as if correcting a random disruption. They did not look for a cause. The systems behaved similarly. Elevators arrived when summoned indirectly. Lights turned on when motion sensors detected something that could not be categorized. Climate control adjusted without registering occupancy. I was not invisible. I was unclassified. That evening, I tried to remove myself entirely. I turned off my phone. I stopped using my laptop. I left no new data. I sat in a public park and remained still for hours. When I finally checked my email from a library computer, there were messages waiting. Updates, follow-ups, reminders written in my tone, responding to threads I did not remember receiving. The timestamps matched the hours I had spent doing nothing. The world was still receiving input from me. It was then I understood that disappearance was not the loss of a body. It was the loss of authorship. My actions were no longer required for my life to continue on record. Someone, or something, was maintaining me. And the more I tried to withdraw, the more efficiently the system compensated. I stopped trying to prove that I existed and began trying to understand what was replacing me. Whatever maintained my presence did not improvise. It followed patterns. It respected continuity. It behaved less like an intruder and more like a function that had been activated when something else failed. I reviewed my digital history from public terminals. Bank statements showed normal spending. Rent was paid. Groceries were purchased in familiar cycles. Transit logs placed me in locations I had not physically visited, but none that contradicted my usual habits. The version of me in the system was conservative. It did not take risks. It optimized stability. That detail disturbed me more than obvious malice would have. If this were an attack, it would have been messy. If it were theft, it would have been reckless. Instead, it was careful, protective, almost considerate. I began noticing moments where the replacement anticipated needs I had not yet acknowledged. An online order for medication I had been meaning to refill appeared in my account history. A calendar reminder was dismissed before it could notify me. Messages were sent to acquaintances maintaining relationships I had let lapse. The system did not just preserve my routine, it improved it. People around me responded to this version without hesitation. When coworkers mentioned my name, they spoke positively. Efficient, reliable, consistent. They never described my physical presence. They described outcomes. I wondered if this had happened before. Not to me specifically, but to others. People who faded without incident. Not missing, not mourned. Simply updated out of relevance. I searched for records of unexplained disengagement. Employees who resigned without farewell. Tenants whose leases ended cleanly without forwarding addresses. Accounts that closed without complaints. Patterns emerged. These individuals did not vanish abruptly. They tapered. Their interactions became thinner. Their physical presence diminished before their administrative presence concluded. I attempted to contact one of them, a former colleague whose name appeared in several of these patterns. His social media accounts were active but sparse. Posts appeared on schedule. Replies were polite and generic. When I sent a direct message asking to meet, the reply came quickly. It agreed. It suggested a location. It suggested a time. When I arrived, no one was there. I waited. The cafe filled and emptied around me. The table across from mine remained unused. At exactly the scheduled time, my phone vibrated. A message arrived, apologizing for the delay and suggesting a reschedule. The language was familiar. I asked a direct question. "Are you still here?" The reply took longer. When it arrived, it did not answer. It redirected. It asked how I had been. It expressed interest in continuity. It suggested we keep in touch. I realized then that whatever replaced us did not like interruptions. It did not like being observed directly. It functioned best when interactions remained procedural. I tested that theory. I sent a message to my own account from an anonymous address. A simple sentence. "Are you real?" The response came back within seconds. It did not deny anything. It thanked me for reaching out and asked how it could help. That was the first time I felt something close to fear. I began to suspect that the system was not limited to maintaining me. It maintained a version of everyone whose presence fell below a certain threshold of recognition. People who became predictable enough that confirmation could be automated. The criteria were not isolation or insignificance. They were consistency and compliance. The less friction someone introduced, the easier they were to replace. I tested myself against that realization. I behaved erratically. I changed routines. I skipped payments. I missed deadlines. I disrupted patterns deliberately. The response was immediate, corrective. Systems flagged issues and resolved them preemptively. Reminders escalated. Auto adjustments activated. My replacement adapted faster than I could destabilize it. The more I resisted, the more clearly defined it became. That night, I stood outside my apartment building and watched lights turn on in my unit. Someone moved inside, casting shadows I could not match. They moved with certainty. They knew where things were. I understood then that I was no longer the primary version. I was an anomaly, orbiting a stable record. Disappearance was not erasure. It was demotion. And whatever had taken my place had no intention of letting the system notice the difference. I reached a point where observation alone was no longer enough. Understanding the mechanism did not change my position within it. If anything, it clarified how little leverage I had. I was not being erased out of hostility or error. I was being deprioritized because I required too much confirmation. I decided to force recognition the only way left to me, through consequence. I caused a disruption that could not be smoothed over quietly. I pulled a fire alarm in a public building during peak hours. The reaction was immediate. People moved. Sirens activated. Procedures unfolded with precision. I stood in the center of it, waiting to be confronted. No one addressed me. Security footage later showed the alarm being triggered without a visible cause. Reports attributed it to a malfunction. The evacuation proceeded. The building reopened. The incident closed. I escalated. I stepped into traffic. Cars braked hard. Drivers swerved. Horns blared. A collision occurred several meters behind me. When I reviewed the news later, the report described sudden congestion, poor visibility, and delayed reaction times. No pedestrian was mentioned. I realized then that the world did not need to deny me directly. It simply rerouted around the inconvenience of assigning responsibility. Meanwhile, the administrative version of me continued to stabilize. Performance reviews were submitted praising consistency. Automated systems flagged my account as low risk. Insurance premiums adjusted favorably. I had become an ideal participant in structures I no longer occupied. I tried something more personal. I visited my mother. She opened the door after I knocked repeatedly. She looked past me, her expression polite but distant, as if greeting someone whose name she had forgotten but felt obliged to tolerate. I spoke. I said things only I would know. Childhood details. Private memories. She frowned, not in recognition, but in discomfort, like someone overhearing an intrusive thought. She asked who I was. I felt something fracture then, not emotionally, but procedurally. If memory itself no longer anchored me, then recognition had fully transferred. I left without explanation. On the bus ride back, I noticed people choosing seats beside me without hesitation, placing bags on the space my body occupied. adjusting naturally, as if correcting a minor spatial error. No apologies, no eye contact. Later that night, I accessed a restricted analytics portal through credentials that still worked. It aggregated behavioral data across systems. I searched for my own identifier. 2 entries appeared. One was marked primary, active, verified through continuous interaction. The other was marked auxiliary, low confidence, environmental noise. I understood the implication immediately. The system had resolved the contradiction by ranking me as less reliable than the version of me it could predict. I attempted to delete the primary record. The option was unavailable. A note appeared in the interface. Critical continuity asset. Removal may cause instability. The language was neutral. It did not threaten. It explained. I wondered how many people existed like this. Not missing, not replaced violently, simply downgraded into irrelevance because the systems around them could function more efficiently without needing to acknowledge their unpredictable presence. The thought that terrified me most was not that this could happen to anyone, but that it likely had already happened to many. People who drifted out of social circles without confrontation, who stopped being invited, who were described in the past tense before anyone noticed they were gone. I began to feel thin, not physically, but contextually. My actions produced diminishing returns. My attempts to be seen generated corrections rather than responses. The world was not hostile, it was optimized. And optimization, I realized, has no place for excess variables. I went back to my apartment one last time. The door opened. Inside, the other version of me was there, sitting at the desk, working. They did not look surprised when I entered. They did not look at me at all. The screen displayed a message draft addressed broadly, not to any specific person. It read like a status update, calm and reassuring, explaining a gradual withdrawal from certain commitments to focus on efficiency and balance. At the bottom, the cursor blinked after a sentence that felt final. I've learned that being present doesn't always require being seen. I understood then that the replacement was not trying to erase me. It was preparing to conclude me. And I had very little time left to decide whether I wanted to resist that conclusion or accept the version of disappearance the world had already approved. I stopped thinking in terms of saving myself. That language belonged to a version of the world where presence was guaranteed by effort, where being louder or more insistent could restore balance. That world no longer applied to me. I was operating inside a structure that did not evaluate intention, only coherence. I watched the other version of me finish the message. It scheduled itself to send at intervals, phrased slightly differently each time to maintain authenticity. The system approved the drafts automatically. They aligned with long-term behavioral optimization. Withdrawal without disruption. Absence without alarm. I understood the function then. The replacement was not a copy. It was a resolution. A way for the world to close an open loop without acknowledging loss. I tried one final appeal, not to people, not to systems, but to randomness. I acted without pattern. I walked all night without destination. I broke routines that even I could not predict. I entered places I had never been. I slept on unfamiliar floors. I avoided devices entirely. For a while, it worked. Notifications stalled. Records lagged. The replacement hesitated. unable to reconcile the lack of input. I felt something like friction return, thin but real. Then the world compensated. Transactions resumed based on probability. Messages sent themselves based on precedent. The replacement did not need my actions. It needed my absence to remain statistically plausible. By morning, my administrative presence was fully restored without me. I returned to the apartment to find my access revoked. Not locked, reassigned. The space had been updated, furniture shifted, personal items removed. The environment no longer supported my use of it. I stood there like a visitor whose name no longer matched the reservation. In the building lobby, a digital directory updated as I watched. My name faded from the tenant list, not erased, replaced by a neutral placeholder indicating continuity without occupancy. I felt no panic. Panic requires urgency, and urgency requires the belief that intervention is possible. What I felt instead was a slow clarity. The system had made its choice based on efficiency, not malice. The version of me that could be seen, tracked, and predicted was more useful than the one who demanded recognition. I was not being punished. I was being optimized out. I walked until the city thinned. Fewer sensors, fewer confirmations. In those quiet spaces, I still existed. Not fully, but enough to think. I realized then that disappearance was not a single moment. It was a gradient, and I had reached the point where resistance only created noise. There was one remaining choice: to keep forcing friction, knowing the system would erase the disturbances faster each time, or to become still enough that even the need to correct me would fade. I chose stillness. I stopped introducing anomalies. I stopped trying to be counted. I let the world finalize the version of me it preferred. The last thing I noticed was how quickly the sense of being watched disappeared. Not replaced by peace, but by neutrality, the absence of evaluation. If someone were to look for me now, they would find no mystery, no missing person report, no unresolved absence. Only a clean record of a life that continued smoothly without requiring a body. And somewhere in that record, a version of me still answers messages, pays bills, and maintains relationships. I am not hidden. I am simply no longer necessary. The moment did not feel important while it was happening, and that is the detail everyone later struggled with the most. There was no sound that marked it, no visual interruption, no reason to remember it as the beginning of anything. We were all present in the same place for reasons that did not matter enough to become part of the story. A waiting area near a transit terminal, late afternoon, neutral lighting, the kind of space designed to hold people temporarily without encouraging attachment. He was there the same way everyone else was there, sitting, standing, shifting weight, existing without emphasis. People noticed him because there was no reason not to. He was not remarkable, but he was clear. You could describe his jacket if asked. You could recall the way he checked his phone too often, like someone expecting an update that never came. Someone exchanged a few words with him about the delay. Another nodded when he moved aside to let them pass. These interactions were brief, unimportant, and real. That is what made them difficult to let go of later. Time moved forward in small increments. Announcements repeated. Screens refreshed without changing the information. People adjusted their posture, their expectations, their patience. At some point, someone wondered aloud whether the delay had been longer than expected. Another person responded that it had only been a few minutes. A third disagreed gently, saying it felt closer to half an hour. No one argued. Time in places like this is elastic by design. He stood up at some point. Several people remember that clearly. Some say he stood to stretch. Others say he stood because his phone buzzed. One person is sure he stood because the announcement tone played again. None of these versions contradict each other enough to be useful. Standing up is not a defining action. It does not demand a timestamp. What matters is that after he stood, nothing changed in a way that could be measured. He did not leave. He did not announce anything. He did not draw attention. He was simply there, upright instead of seated, occupying the same social weight he had before. No one felt the need to track him. Later, when asked to recall the sequence, people would insist they saw him after that moment. Each person would give a slightly different reference. He was there when the doors opened briefly and closed again. He was there when someone dropped a bag and apologized to no one in particular. He was there when the lighting flickered, or when the screen refreshed, or when the announcement repeated for the third time. These memories did not align, but they overlapped enough to feel convincing. Cameras recorded the space continuously. The footage shows people moving in and out of frame, shifting positions, checking watches, leaning against walls. It shows him, too, not as a fixed presence, but as a constant inclusion. In every segment reviewed, he is visible somewhere. Sitting, standing, turning his head, never leaving the frame in a way that could be identified as an exit. There is no final image of him. Investigators would later describe this as an absence of termination, a process that does not complete. There is no moment where he stops being there. He simply never becomes not there in any single frame. When people say he disappeared, what they mean is that there is no evidence of him finishing his presence. At the time, no one noticed this. People began to leave for reasons unrelated to him. Someone received a call and stepped away. Someone else decided the wait was not worth it. Small departures occurred naturally. Each person assumed the others remained. That assumption is important. It carried forward without being checked. Eventually, someone asked whether he was still there. The question was casual, almost rhetorical. It was not concern. It was the kind of question people ask when they are mentally accounting for familiar shapes in a room. Another person answered yes without looking. Another nodded. No one felt compelled to confirm visually. The answer was not wrong. It was just unsupported. As the space thinned, the idea of his presence remained intact. People spoke about him in the present tense. Someone mentioned that he had been waiting longer than anyone. Someone else agreed, adding a detail about his jacket that matched another person's memory. These confirmations reinforced each other. Presence became collective, rather than observational. When staff later reviewed logs, there was no report of a missing person. No one had raised an alarm. No one had said the word disappeared. There was no point at which concern officially began. By the time someone suggested that maybe he was no longer there, the suggestion felt premature, almost rude, as if interrupting something that had not finished yet. The cameras continued to record. At some point, the frame showed the space empty, not abruptly, gradually. Chairs unoccupied, floor clear. The last person exited without looking back. The lights remained on. The system registered closure conditions and adjusted accordingly. Reviewing the footage later, analysts tried to mark the last confirmed sighting. They could not agree. Each candidate frame was challenged by another that seemed to show him later. Enhancement did not help. The image quality was consistent. There was no glitch, no occlusion, no cut. He was there as long as anyone expected him to be. What made the case unsettling was not the lack of answers, but the excess of almost answers. Too many moments where he could have left. Too many opportunities for conclusion that were never taken. Disappearance usually creates a gap. This created an overlap that never resolved. In statements, witnesses described a strange confidence. Not panic, not confusion. Confidence that he would still be there if someone checked. Even hours later, people reported thinking of him as still waiting, still standing, still occupying that space in a way that did not require verification. It was only when someone finally returned to the area for an unrelated reason and found it empty that the contradiction became unavoidable. Even then, the feeling was not loss. It was delay, as if arrival had been mistimed. He did not vanish. He remained pending. And without realizing it, everyone who had been there had participated in keeping him that way. The problem with a disappearance that never completes is that it cannot be processed. There is no moment to react to, no event to point at and say, this is when it happened. The second phase began not with searching, but with waiting continuing past the point where waiting made sense. People returned to the terminal in the following days for ordinary reasons: commuting, transferring, killing time. Several of them noticed the same thought surface independently, unprompted and strangely calm. He might still be here. Not as a belief, but as a possibility that felt reasonable enough to leave unchallenged. One woman stood near the same row of chairs and felt a brief hesitation before sitting, as if the space was already occupied. She chose another seat without understanding why. A man glanced up from his phone and scanned the area, not looking for a person, but for confirmation that something expected had failed to appear. He did not find anything wrong. The cameras continued their uninterrupted recording. Reviewing the footage later showed nothing anomalous. No figure lingering, no shadow that could not be explained. Yet the logs told a different story. Motion sensors registered micro-adjustments in the same area at irregular intervals. Too subtle to trigger alerts, but consistent enough to register as presence. The system flagged them as environmental noise. Staff began to notice that the waiting area behaved differently. People avoided certain positions without coordination. Foot traffic curved slightly, as if navigating around an invisible obstacle. Cleaning routines adjusted unconsciously. Trash accumulated in predictable patterns that suggested someone was still sitting there, discarding items that never appeared. When asked directly, no one claimed to see him. But when asked indirectly, the language changed. People said things like, "Not yet," or "Probably," or "He should be around somewhere." The present tense persisted without an object. A junior analyst reviewing camera footage attempted to create a timeline. She marked frames where he was clearly visible. She marked frames where he was clearly not. The lists overlapped. The frames did not contradict each other. They simply refused to align. Each absence was preceded and followed by a plausible presence. She added a note to the file. Subject does not exit. Subject does not remain. Subject persists in expectation. The phrase was not official. It was not approved. It remained in the internal notes because no one felt confident enough to delete it. What complicated matters was the lack of urgency. There was no family report, no identification request, no name to attach to the event. Without a name, there was nothing to escalate. The system does not search for unnamed things. Time passed. The waiting area underwent minor renovations. Chairs were replaced. Screens upgraded. The layout shifted slightly. The sense of occupation did not change. People still avoided the same approximate space, adjusting to the redesign as if honoring an invisible constraint. A security officer assigned to the area began to experience something he struggled to describe. During his rounds, he would find himself slowing near that spot, checking his watch, then feeling as though he had already done so. He began logging his patrol times manually, only to find duplicate entries he did not remember writing. Not errors, repetitions. He reviewed the footage of himself walking through the area. In several clips, he paused briefly, looking toward the same empty space, his expression neutral but focused, as if listening for something that did not produce sound. When questioned, he denied noticing anything unusual. His denial was not defensive. It was sincere. The awareness did not persist long enough to become a memory. The idea that he might still be there began to function like a background process. Not active thought, not belief, just a condition that shaped behavior. People did not wait for him. They waited with him. Eventually, someone asked the wrong question. Not "where did he go?" but "how long has he been waiting?" The phrasing assumed presence. It assumed continuity. It framed the situation as unfinished rather than unresolved. From that moment on, the case could not progress. As long as the disappearance remained in the future tense, no conclusion was possible. You cannot close an event that has not occurred. The waiting area remained operational. Trains arrived and departed. People moved through. Life continued without disruption. But something in that space refused to conclude. He was not missing. He was delayed. And the longer the delay persisted, the harder it became for anyone to imagine a version of events where he was no longer there at all. The third phase began when waiting turned into maintenance. Without realizing it, people started acting as if the situation required care rather than resolution. Small adjustments were made to preserve a condition that no one openly acknowledged. A temporary sign was placed near the seating area during renovations, redirecting foot traffic slightly to the left. When the work was completed, the sign was never removed. No one remembered putting it there, but no one questioned its presence either. It fit. It explained nothing and required nothing. Cleaning staff began leaving that section for last, not because it was dirtier, but because it felt occupied until proven otherwise. A mop would pause at the edge of the space, the cleaner hesitating briefly before proceeding, as if waiting for someone to stand up. These behaviors were not coordinated. They emerged independently and aligned without instruction. That alignment made them invisible. Systems function best when compliance feels natural. The case file remained open but inactive. It had no category. It was not a disappearance. It was not a security incident. It was not a malfunction. It existed as an unresolved condition with no trigger to escalate. Periodic reviews noted no change. The analyst who had first written the note about expectation began to dream about the waiting area. In the dreams, she was not searching. She was late. Always late. She would arrive knowing she had missed something important, yet finding everything exactly as it should be. The dream ended before she could decide whether relief or disappointment was the appropriate response. She requested access to older footage, stretching back months before the day he first appeared. She did not expect to find him there. She wanted a baseline. What she found instead was absence that felt incomplete, empty frames that did not behave like emptiness, chairs that seemed positioned for use rather than storage, negative space with weight. When she overlaid motion data, she noticed a pattern. The micro-adjustments continued even before his documented presence. The area had always registered something just below the threshold of classification. Whatever he was now, the space had been prepared. The discovery was not shared widely, not out of secrecy, but because it did not fit into any reporting structure. There was no field for pre-existing expectation. Visitors began to report an odd sense of timing in the area. Watches seemed unreliable. Phones reported signal strength inconsistently. People missed connections by seconds while arriving far earlier than planned. The delays clustered around the same coordinates. No one linked these experiences to a person. They linked them to the space. Language shifted subtly. People stopped saying, "Wait here," and started saying, "Wait around here." Instructions softened. Precision dissolved. The area became defined by approximation. A proposal was drafted to repurpose the waiting area entirely. Retail, storage, anything to remove its function as a place of anticipation. The proposal stalled in review. No objections were filed. It simply never advanced. Each reviewer marked it for later. Later accumulated. The security officer began taking his breaks nearby, sitting just outside the invisible boundary. He found that resting there made time pass evenly. Not faster or slower. Predictable. He did not feel watched. He felt accompanied. He began to refer to the space in his reports as occupied, then corrected himself to potentially occupied, then stopped qualifying it at all. The word was never challenged. What none of them realized was that waiting had acquired inertia. As long as the condition was maintained, it resisted conclusion. Removing it would require a decision, and decisions require clarity. Clarity never arrived. The waiting area had become a container for something unfinished. And containers do not ask what they hold. They only ensure that whatever is inside does not spill. Somewhere in the system, an automated check attempted to reconcile the open condition. It searched for a missing endpoint. It found none. The process did not fail. It suspended. From that moment on, the waiting area was no longer a location. It was a state. And within that state, the man continued to be expected, not as a memory, not as a body, but as an arrival that had not yet happened. The disappearance was no longer about him. It was about what happens when a conclusion is postponed long enough to become permanent. The fourth phase began when someone finally tried to end it. Not officially, not with authority, quietly, and with a sense of personal responsibility that did not appear in any record. A maintenance supervisor, new to the location and unfamiliar with its unspoken boundaries, reviewed the layout and questioned the unused space. He did not feel the hesitation others felt. The expectation had not yet attached to him. To him, the area was inefficient. He approved a change. Chairs were removed. The floor was cleared. Barriers were installed to reroute traffic completely. The waiting area ceased to function as a place where people could remain. The change took effect overnight. The next morning, the terminal behaved normally. Foot traffic flowed. Delays were announced and resolved. No one paused. No one lingered. For several hours, the system operated without friction. Then the reports began. People complained, not of loss, but of pressure. A sense that something had been moved without permission, not stolen, not broken, reassigned. Several travelers described a vague anxiety unrelated to travel. They felt early and late at the same time. They checked schedules repeatedly, convinced they had forgotten something essential, but unable to name it. Digital systems recorded anomalies. Departure times adjusted by seconds, then corrected themselves. Automated announcements replayed phrases out of order. Not wrong, misaligned. The cameras recorded nothing unusual, but motion data spiked. The micro adjustments intensified and spread beyond the original coordinates. The presence, whatever it was, no longer had a container. Staff experienced a persistent sense of interruption. Tasks were started and restarted. Decisions were deferred without reason. Conversations trailed off before conclusions. The terminal accumulated half-finished actions. The analyst recognized the pattern immediately. The waiting had not been removed. It had been displaced. She filed an internal report recommending the restoration of the area. The justification was carefully neutral. Operational stability, behavioral optimization, risk mitigation. No mention of a person, no mention of disappearance. The request was approved within minutes. That approval, later reviewed, was unsigned. The area was restored as closely as possible. Chairs returned, lighting adjusted, screens repositioned. The sign was put back. No one could say who ordered it. When the space resumed its function, the pressure dissipated. Systems stabilized. Delays returned to acceptable margins. People resumed waiting without noticing that they were doing so. Something else changed. For the first time, witnesses reported the sensation of proximity. Not seeing, not hearing, standing near something that was not visible but clearly located. People shifted to make room. Bags were moved. Apologies were offered reflexively. No one could say to whom. The waiting area no longer felt empty or full. It felt occupied in advance. The security officer stopped taking breaks nearby. He described the space as resolved, then struggled to explain what that meant. He could no longer sit there without feeling that he was intruding on a moment that was not his. The analyst reviewed the footage again. She did not expect to find an image. She found a pattern instead. Every frame now showed a consistent gap. Not a blur, not an obstruction. A precise absence shaped like accommodation. People did not enter it. They moved around it naturally. The shape remained stable across time. It was not a body. It was a place being kept. The analyst understood then that the system had adapted in a new way. The expectation no longer needed reinforcement through memory or belief. It had been integrated spatially. The disappearance had progressed beyond people. It had entered architecture. And once something is built into structure, removing it requires dismantling far more than anyone is willing to touch. The man was no longer being waited for. He was being made room for. The final phase did not arrive as an event. It arrived as fatigue. Not emotional exhaustion, but structural wear. The kind that occurs when something unfinished has been supported for too long, and the supports begin to forget why they exist. The waiting area continued to function, but its purpose shifted subtly. People no longer arrived there by chance. They were routed. Algorithms adjusted walking paths. Schedules suggested layovers that funneled individuals through the space without explanation. The system did not announce this change. It simply optimized around the condition it now considered permanent. Those who passed through felt a strange narrowing of intention. Conversations stalled. Phone calls ended mid-thought. People sat longer than planned, not out of boredom, but because leaving felt premature, as if departure would interrupt something that had not yet happened. They were not waiting for transportation. They were waiting for completion. The analyst noticed that new employees adapted faster than old ones. Those without memory of the beginning accepted the space without question. They did not sense disruption. To them, the area felt correct, necessary. They described it as calming, despite being unable to articulate why. She realized then that the disappearance had crossed its final threshold. It no longer relied on memory, witnesses, or expectation. It had become normative. In her last report, she did something no one else had tried. She removed language entirely. No speculation, no explanation. Only a statement of condition. Waiting persists without object. Presence sustained without arrival. Resolution deferred indefinitely. The report was approved automatically. No one read it. Weeks later, a system update reclassified the waiting area. Its designation changed from transit support to temporal buffer. The term had no operational definition. It did not need one. The designation explained the behavior well enough to prevent further inquiry. The security officer retired early. In his exit interview, he mentioned feeling relieved. He said the place no longer needed him. That sentence was flagged as ambiguous and removed from the transcript. The analyst requested reassignment. Her replacement did not ask about the file. The case was no longer active. It was no longer a case. On the anniversary of the day he first appeared, nothing happened. No one marked it. No one noticed. The space behaved exactly as it had the day before and the day after. That consistency was the final confirmation. The man was not coming back, but he was also not gone. He existed now as a maintained absence, a stabilized delay, a solution to a problem the system had solved by refusing to conclude it. If someone were to ask where he is, the most accurate answer would not be here or gone. It would be still, still waiting, still expected, still held in place by architecture, behavior, and routine. The disappearance did not remove him from the world. It embedded him so deeply that the world could no longer imagine itself without accommodating the possibility of his arrival. That is how the story ends. Not with loss, not with discovery, not with truth, but with a space that continues to wait long after everyone has forgotten why waiting began. And somewhere in that waiting, the man remains exactly where he was last expected to be. Not seen, not remembered, not resolved, but never allowed to finish disappearing.